Big nuclear, as we knew it from the past in the US, is likely not going to see another plant construction any day soon. Fusion is sort of the get out of jail card free.
Yeah.
If we are capable, and I believe we are, within the next 10 years to bring this to the level where we can begin to commercialize it, then I think we've got an ideal opportunity.
This is EnergyCast, and I'm Jay Dowenhauer. Today we're talking about commercial nuclear fusion, how to develop the world's best hope for abundant, baseload, pollution-free, carbon-free energy in a business model where the final product may not be available for decades. Like the space program, this was long the specialty of governments.
It's one small step for man.
But as we see today, space is now commercialized, with SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic now blasting off and running for-profit businesses. The one big difference is that Americans planted a flag on the moon 33 years before SpaceX, for instance, was founded.
One giant leap for mankind.
The companies developing nuclear fusion reactors are still working to develop long-sustained plasmas, which are critical for the technology to work. Our guest today says they're able to keep their lights on in a few ways. First, they have a board of all-stars, essentially, the Carnegies and Rockefellers of the 21st century. Our guest today had also received critical funding at a time from the now late Paul Allen, who recently died in October. My guest board is made up of former bosses of GE, Morgan Stanley, the Department of Energy, and if there's anyone who can muster the financial firepower to essentially will the future into existence, it's these guys. I imagine these guys could be pretty intimidating if they wanted to be, but they can also be the greatest champion, especially if a company follows the second key to success, ensuring that every technological milestone is reached. For instance, they reached a sustained plasma milestone in 2015, first plasma on their next-gen machine in 2017, and so on. And then finally, it doesn't hurt to find a way to start generating revenue in the meantime, using the intellectual property from nearly 20 years of research. My guest just spun off a biomedical company earlier this year. On a personal note, I spent a few months advising on a company here in Charlotte called Atom Power, which was just starting to commercialize a revolutionary solid-state circuit breaker. They had a lot of investment support from Siemens, but that whole time Atom was running a for-profit engineering firm to ensure at least some money was coming in. So let's get to this technology. As we discussed in my last nuclear fusion episode, the core of the technology is fusing two hydrogen isotopes into helium. The same process is happening in the sun. The process typically requires deuterium and tritium, which are hydrogen atoms with 2 and 3 neutrons. When they fuse, they form helium, a neutron, and lots of heat. The beauty of this technology is that these isotopes occur naturally in water, providing us with an essentially endless supply of energy. You probably remember the 96 film Chain Reaction, where Keanu Reeves essentially builds something similar and the government wants him dead.
I think I did it.
Is it stable?
There is enough energy in this glass of water to power the city of Chicago for weeks.
They went too far.
Shannon, who are you?
I'm your friend, Eddie. I may be your only friend.
We can't trust anyone.
One interesting point is that a chain reaction is a term for nuclear fission, not nuclear fusion. Just saying. The most challenging aspect of nuclear fusion, and the reason why we don't have fusion plants outside every major municipality, is that developing the containment for the plasma created is challenging. In the vacuum of space, the sun and stars do this by gravity. Here on Earth, magnetic fields have to contain the reaction. The most common design used by aspirational fusion developers is the tokamak design, which looks like a fat donut. It's been around since the 1950s and has been incorporated in the International ITER project in France. Our guest today uses a slightly different design. It's called the Field Reverse Configuration, FRC, that uses closed magnetic rings rather than a physical barrier. The particles have been described as a smoke ring configuration. Our guest also changes up the fuel mix, trading deuterium and tritium for common hydrogen and boron-11, which is the most common boron isotope and also found in water.
There is enough energy in this glass of water to power the city of Chicago for weeks.
Okay, we get it. Let's get on with it. My guest today is Dr. Michael Binderbauer, CEO of TAE Technologies and co-inventor of many of the company's core technologies. TAE has been known as Tri-Alpha Energy most of its existence. They're based in Orange County, California. They were founded in 1998, but stayed below the radar until about 5 years ago. Now that they've started to demonstrate plasmas, the company is at the forefront of the nuclear fusion discussion. Earlier this year, they spun off a biomedical company, TAE Life Sciences, which will provide a boron-neutron-based cancer therapy. As I said earlier, it's nice to put all those years of research to good use. I've also covered a lot of fusion technology particulars in my previous fusion episode, episode 20. So in this interview, I wanted to discuss the company's path to commercialization, why the public may be a bigger influencer on the success than we think, and of course, what it's like running a company that's essentially designing the future. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Michael Binderbauer. We're here with Michael Binderbauer, CEO of TAE Technologies. And Michael, first question, with so much money being spent on the ITER project in France, why do you think a private sector venture like TAE is the better way to develop something as complex as nuclear fusion?
Jay, great question. Obviously, we get this asked a lot. And I think the answer is rather simple. As any evolutionary technology project, it requires a lot of focus and a lot of quick on-the-spot thinking. And it also requires capital that's more or less there when you call on it. In other words, it's not something where you have to every year try to find a way to renew it. That makes it very inefficient. And I think the private sector is uniquely capable of delivering on those elements. Lots of technology has really been matured in private hands. Tri-Alpha is a money-by-milestone shop. We've been challenged every time to deliver on budget, on time, milestone, and then basically deserve to live another day. But what's nice about this is, and what's inherently different now in the way I will characterize the sort of publicly funded side, is that there's an inherent proposition that when you deliver, you're going to get the next tranche. Investors are not interested to cut things off, but to see things to conclusion to get a return, right? In the governmentally funded projects, you typically find that that is not necessarily true. So there's a higher level of efficiency and certainty, and that makes for better capability to plan and execute. And I think this is one of the key things. What's perhaps most important to actually get a functional product is the fact that an industry, i.e. the utility sector, is going to utilize the output of our work, right? What is important here is that the voice of the customer and the voice of those that ultimately will use it and finance these power plants comes in early, because it's going to redefine the technology. It has to have maintenance and things that are within the realm of the utility. It can't be over sophisticated technological specs that only PhD level qualified people or operators could run with. The kind of logical things. And this is something that if you look at the current large scale outside fusion program, that inherent intimate connection isn't typically there. It's first viewed as we've got a very massively difficult science project. We've got to get through that. And then we're going to figure out the engineering and economics and the other steps. And then we'll eventually get the big energy contributing companies involved. And they will come in and they'll productize that to a commercial product. And I think we can do it faster. I believe we can do it cheaper. And I think we can ultimately get there and get there sooner.
And we've talked in the past, and I'm not going to spend every question talking about you and ITER, but they are planning somewhere in the 2030s, right? It's still a long way away before they...
Yeah.
And they're using the tokamak design, the donut shape, and you're using the field reverse configuration, which is your own technology. Neither design is commercial yet. Do you think there's a future where both of these designs are commercial and are being used in power plants?
Well, I'll tell you, this always gets to that question of sort of competition, right? And in some ways, I like to not slickly deflect that, but I say, first of all, I hope one of the fusionists succeeds. Now, certainly, given my role and my life's dedication to it, I hope Tri-Alpha is the party that succeeds. But that said, I think one of us needs to succeed. And then the question is, could there be multiple? I could certainly see that. And I would suppose that they would probably find different niches to scale into. I'm not in very intimate detail familiar with the economic nuances of a tokamak design to speak here with any kind of authority. But the level that I've looked at it, I see where our big advantages are is that we can build with the field reverse configurations a very compact design. design. It can be economic from the perspective that it's physically just smaller scale at same level of power output. And there's a metric in the field that we call beta, which is a pressure ratio between the pressure of the magnetic field and the pressure that you get in the gas inside that cooks. In the tokamak world, that ratio is typically about 10-ish%. In the world of the FRCs or field reverse configurations, that ratio tends to be high 80s to lower 90s. So in that sense, it's compact. It's very efficient in utilizing the magnetic field. From an economics perspective, the principal drivers that made us convinced and excited about the opportunity on that, and that's a bit of a handicap in the tokamak design. But like you said, neither one is at this point commercial. So there's still a race on. And in the end, frankly, there may be some scale where tokamak makes some sense. I'm not saying that exists or doesn't exist, but it may be there. And if it's there, the market will find it, right? By the way, the market is so huge that there's plenty of space.
Right. And, and I was kind of thinking the same, maybe it's a bad comparison, but there's a lot of different nuclear reactors out there. There's not just one design, right? So,
yeah, absolutely.
Getting a little bit more technical in the technology, I never was really clear on this. There are two methods for creating electricity from fusion that I'm aware of. Thermal conversion, basically just heat up steam, right? And direct conversion, where I'm going to butcher this, but basically the plasma is making electricity directly. It's not having to go through some steam intermediate. Are you only considering one of these, or is it still too early for that?
Oh, yeah. So this is a good question in the sense that it shows you an interesting opportunity that, again, gets back to the practical application. In the conventional fuels that are being pursued in a system like ITER or a tokamak derivative eventual power plant, you'd be operating with two hydrogen isotopes, deuterium and tritium, right? They produce neutrons. And so the neutrons, I always think of these sort of like dumb billiard ball particulates that come out, and they are not steerable because they're not electrically interactable. They're neutral, that's by definition. And so they'll just plow into material. And the way you get the energy out, which comes in the form of kinetic energy, these particles are moving really fast, right? And they have to essentially get stopped through collisions. And usually that means destructive things happening in, say, a metallic surface that they hit, where they are going to dislodge atoms out of the lattice, and that leads to some fatigue in materials, and that's a big issue. But the point is, at some point, it's thermalization. You're converting all that into thermal energy, and it's really the only way we know how to stop and eventually extract neutron energy, right? So this is one of the areas where, if you look at a tokamak design, you're kind of limited to doing it in a thermal way. Now, on our side, we're, of course, interested in hydrogen boron, and these are charged particles. Now, of course, you could slow them down just like the neutron, and you can extract the energy thermally. More importantly, where we're pivoting now is to trap all these particles in the core, and ultimately the energy cascades to hot electrons. This is a similar process that's used at NLEX, right? When you're at Venice, they hit a plate in that case, and they decelerate, and they release high-energy photons, i.e. X-rays, and that's how they image your teeth. In the case of this system, these hot electrons would radiate these photons off. You stop that with a thin shell of metallic surroundings, and that will heat that shell up. You can then do a thermal conversion, or you could have, instead of that metallic shell, a surface of, I'll call it for the moment, solar cells on steroids. Yeah. And they would interact with that directly. And so now you're converting photon energy directly into electricity. And so, yes, we are actually looking at all of it. I think there's a clear generational evolution that makes sense, which is thermal first. The technology in nuclear plants, coal plants, et cetera, they all run on thermal conversion systems. Generation 2, you have this interior surface covered with this solar cells on steroids that is going to convert that directly. And the uptick is you get rid of all the mechanical moving parts. It becomes less complex from an engineering perspective, smaller machine, more solid state components. And even if it's just 50% conversion efficiency on these, that would be a big improvement, cost and functionality and maintenance, and it could likely be a lot higher. So yes, we're dual track.
And let's talk about the future. I think most people, when they think of nuclear fusion, they think once it's commercial, it will create almost an unlimited amount of electricity from a single reactor. But you think there's a limit to the amount that a single reactor could generate. This was from your website. It suggested that 200 to 500 megawatts was practical for a single unit. Do you still think that, or do you think it could be unlimited size?
Yeah, good question. There is this notion in fusion called ignition, which I think is theoretical. It's the idea that you would eventually get to a point where the fuel self-sustains. The notion is at some point you can turn the auxiliary or the heat power off, and the system just self-generates, and then it's sort of infinite gain. There's still finite amount of power coming out. I mean, first of all, it depends on how large your volume is, how much fuel you're cooking, right? How much power is there for produced in total, and then conversion efficiencies and so on. So there's always a limited amount of power. And then the question really becomes, what is a sensible size? One is what works for the market, what works for the grid, right? The other component is what works for the technology. And then thirdly, what works for the science. And so when you combine these things and you do this multidimensional optimization, you very quickly come to a good game plan point being 0.5 gigawatt-ish. And it turns out from what you saw on our website, 350, 450, these are all really good numbers. It turns out that the design of magnets at that point is within technological reach today. There's nothing esoteric we need. These are much more simple and cost efficient and smaller scale than what ITER already needs. And that's just a demonstration, not a power plant. And then you come to, does the physics work there? Yes, it does. And what about the grid? Well, gas turbines today are on that scale typically. So the grid is used to deploying incremental units. And if you wanted gigawatts out of one facility, you would probably co-deploy 4 or 5 of these things. I wouldn't say it's the optimal sweet spot, but it's certainly a local maximum where these different things optimize to, and that's kind of where we're at.
And in working in transmission, there is a limit to the amount of wires that can come out of a single location, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you see a future? I think a lot of people just assume that once this is commercial, it will just kind of proliferate. Yeah, and this will be just how we make electricity. Do you see a future in which all baseload electric generation is fusion, or are there still fossil fuels in some places, conventional nuclear fission?
Right.
150 years in the future, what does that look like as far as
our
portfolio?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I have never looked 150 years forward, but I worry about how we're going to commercialize and what our space is going to be like. And there's a dynamic going on, which you're very much aware of. The utility sector, the entire energy generation spectrum, there's a strong mobilization on the side of renewables. They've come down in price dramatically. We also know there's a price to be paid for doing that. Yeah. It's not all just sunshine and great there, and the economics is wonderful. I think if I look, let's say the next 30, 40 years, we think today, sensibly speaking, we can begin commercialization second half of the next decade. So in the second half of the 20s. So let's say by 2030, our first power plant starts to join the grid as a generating unit. So now you look forward for the next 20, 25 years. What does it look like? Well, first of all, the technology is probably supply constrained to one level. I mean, first of all, you've got to get a whole new supply chain going. These accelerators, the magnets, the world knows how to build some of these. We don't have economic scale capability today. We're going to have to grow into that. So even if we're the best choice, bar none, under all circumstances, universally, and everybody accepts that, there would still be a constraint. You look at the generational technologies that came in historically, they all have a ramp up. Perhaps this will be faster adoption than before, but there's a time frame. The other thing you have, and you know this better than I do, the sector you work for is a very conservative sector of industry, for good reasons, right? Light better turns on when somebody flips the switch. Right. So you have now a new technology coming in like ours that has all these esoteric bells and whistles and an unproven track record of reliability. So I would say you'll have adoption hurdles that come just from, let's see, us getting up to 80, 90% capacity factor. Yeah. How long will that take? And that's a learning curve of running the first commercial plants and getting smart about it. And then lastly, the other available generation assets. And I think what you'll find happening is there will be some form of a coexistence between some areas of the world where renewables make sense, and then areas where technologies like ours, high power density, relatively flexible load following capability. I don't know what the right word these days is. Is it dispatchable power now? I think baseline power has become a bit sort of a non-liked vocabulary. At least our former CEO, says don't use the word baseload anymore. Whichever way you call it, I think we have these great attributes that make it universally appealing. And I think if we understand that if we have to placard the entire environment outside with solar panels and wind farms, I think you will find what you really want in these dense megacities, high power density, sources of power that can generate right in where the consumption is without any detrimental effects of carbon and pollution or other radioactive fallout. And I think this is where this technology would shine.
It's funny you said one of your former executives had a negative view of the word baseload. I've always considered that reliable. I love big, beautiful baseload, by the way. It's not a big...
Yeah, and I want to correct that in Steve's favor here. He was saying, look, it's becoming less the fashionable word to use, right? It's more probably dispatchable power or something like that.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. But look, right now in 2018, if you want to talk about reliable, carbon-free, underscore that, energy, it's nuclear fission. But yet everyone seems to be running away from it. In my office alone, we had several refugees come from the failed VC Summer project. They just didn't want to do it. And so my question is, Michael, does this create an opportunity for fusion to step up over the next few decades? Because you really don't have any options as far as big hundreds of megawatts at a single location baseload energy if you don't have of conventional nuclear.
Yeah, I hear you. I agree 100% with everything you said. I think we are in a somewhat schizophrenic world. There's a big opportunity, by the way, for the likes of TAE, right?
Yeah.
The reality is, again, as a citizen of the planet first and as a technologically somewhat educated person, I don't have a problem with fusion energy. I really don't. You said it very well. It's the only available carbon-free source, period. Right?
Yeah.
The fact is that's it. And so if we are serious about cleaning up our love affair with carbon polluting generation technologies, then that's where it ends. On the other hand, as you pointed out, and I mentioned earlier, Steve's affiliation with Southern, they're going through the pains of the vocal plants, right?
Yeah.
Big nuclear, as we knew it from the past in the US, is likely not going to see another plant construction any day soon. Maybe never. And I think that opens up opportunities. And I guess the question will become, who's going to step in? I mean, if we are capable, and I believe we are, within the next 10 years to bring this to the level where we can begin to commercialize it, then I think we've got an ideal opportunity. The other technology that may step in would be these small SMRs, where I hope we would have a leg up, and assuming both can be successful in terms of realizing their goals and then being economically feasible, you come down to which one would you rather deploy. And I think there, one other big element we haven't talked about is regulation. What's the regulatory framework for a fusion technology, for instance? And I think this is where a lot of education has to come in, not just on the level of the regulators, but on the public at large side. I think this is one of the most important things, and one of the impediments for fusion's successful rollout is for people to understand that it shares the commonality of being nuclear, quote unquote, but it has very little to do with fission, right? And I want to take this opportunity to promote this, and this is really for everybody in fusion. What is the great advantage of fusion is that it isn't driven by a chain process. It isn't a self-propagating affair. In fact, it's very hard to start, and it's even harder to keep going. And if anything goes wrong in one of these plants, and this is true for everybody else that does fusion, you end up with a system that will stop. No control system could shut down a fusion machine faster than nature does itself. Yeah. So what makes it so hard also makes it so appealing from a safety perspective. And so I think this is the other point that will give fusion an edge, and ours in particular, is that from a regulatory safety perspective, adoption makes so much sense as long as people appreciate that difference. And I think this is where I love talking to people like you, and hope a lot of people will listen to this, that they start to appreciate, yes, this is nuclear, but it's a very different form than the one we're commonly accustomed to with its problems sometimes, which is fission, which is not what we do. And it doesn't have the same radiative footprint. And if there's an accident, it's sort of self-shutting down. It's quite different.
Michael, you've kind of said this earlier. I'm sure there's a Gantt chart in one of your boardrooms with a commercialization date milestone. What does that date say currently? I know you got one.
I will tell you, I never straightforwardly answer that. But no, and that's not because I don't know. I mean, obviously, we have to have a notion, and we do. But I also want to point out, in the past, fusion sometimes has been sort of overhyped, the promise, and then underdelivered. And we've been very careful here. I'm not here to say that tomorrow we're going to build a power plant. I'm here to say that we're very close to getting science perfected to the point where we can actually take the leap to build an integrated net energy producing machine. Today, we finish our science proof experiment sometime in the early part of 2019. We migrate on to a machine that we now call Copernicus, which would be a net energy demonstration facility.
Is this different from Norman?
Yeah, Norman is a current machine. That's what I call a proof of science device, which gives us the confidence that we can now scale this to a power plant.
Right.
Let's say by the first half of the 20s, 23, 24, this thing is starting to huff and puff. And at that point, you would have net energy from fusion demonstrated, and you're now in a position to begin a commercialization process. This first machine, Copernicus, is certainly going to miss the mark on being the most economic. It's a hand-built one-up. You have to learn a lot on it. You would use it as a jumping board that then becomes a first commercial unit. You're scratching the end of the next decade in terms of where this deploys. It's about a 10-year time frame to what I would call being in the commercialization phase. That's kind of what our boardroom Gantt chart says. It doesn't have a particular date on there yet.
I think that's fair enough. And look, projects, things happen.
Of course, you know that.
When you're creating technology like this, I totally get that. This is not a fusion-related question, but it just was so crazy. I noticed in your materials you said you partnered with Google to apply machine learning to this project. Okay, I'm getting thoughts of Skynet in my head. Explain, what does that mean, machine learning?
Yeah, that's actually, some of your listeners may have seen, we published one highlight of that collaborative activity last year in one of the Nature journals in Scientific Reports on what we call the optometrist algorithm. And it's one of the products that came out of this relationship. In this case, it goes towards exploiting machine learning for improving the efficiency of data taking and scientific learning. One is, how does a power plant operate? It's going to need some form of active controls, feedback. It's in a desired state or it's in an off state, and how do I bring it back? And the other part is, how do you efficiently get data? The hardest to pinpoint is, how long will it take you to run the science experiments on any phase of our evolution, right? And this is where I think machine learning wasn't just promise, it really, really makes a big difference. And this gets to the very heart of technological innovation. The notion of fail fast so you can learn fast. You want to break things. You need to learn from what didn't work so you can find the thing that works and optimize it. Look at our current machine learning. It's like 2 double-decker buses in length, consumes 750 megawatts of power, and we want to tweak it. What used to take us months and a half, we can now do in half an afternoon.
Wow.
We can dial in a new hardware in its fairly optimized state. We can now dial it in and sometimes get the science dispensed within an afternoon as well. So we can prototype a new idea in literally a day or two.
Did you approach Google, or was it the other way around? How'd that
No, I did approach them. Okay. I had some friends there in Google X. We struck a chord, gave some lectures up there and so on. And ultimately, we came together in around 2014.
Michael, I got to ask, especially since we're talking about Google, I want to get a window into your life. You must have the most incredible conversations all the time. I'm imagining that at some point, Elon Musk has saddled up next to you and said, hey, I want to use your fusion reactors in my rockets. So what kind of conversations do you have with people?
Well, I don't have conversations with Elon, I can tell you that. But, safe of that, no. But outside of Elon, who I respect greatly for what he does, it's amazing, SpaceX in particular, and the gutsy thing to try to get into the car business, if you historically look how hard that is. If you add all the steps that we've taken so far, and you look at the probability of success, they're very tiny, right? This is all frontier stuff. And we're doing this now for 20 years. We've now deployed about 600 million of capital. How does all that come together? I was invited to do one of these commencement speeches earlier this year at UCI, and I told the students, this is the great purpose behind this. Behind any successful project, if it has greater purpose than for yourself, it becomes this magnet of pulling people and getting affectionate contributions and energy towards it. And to the point of what you asked there, it is incredibly rewarding. The kind of people that pay attention to it and get interested, you haven't talked about our board, but incredible people on there, right? They could do a lot of meaningful things with their life. Why did they come to this project? It is because of that great purpose that it has at the end of the line and the promise that's inherent with that. And this has allowed me and others like me to get access to people and have conversations, as you said, that must be exciting. They are. Sometimes it's just getting to know people on that more personal level that you read about in the paper and have conversations and get to learn their worldview and things and how it jives with yours and with this opportunity here. Those are just incredibly enriching stories that I wouldn't miss for a moment. That's obvious, yeah.
You mentioned your board. These guys, wow, it's like a who's who of talent. You have, I'm going to name drop a few, former GE CEO Jeff Immelt, former Morgan Stanley CEO John Mack, former DOE Secretary Oni Moniz, Paul Allen. He's not on your board, right?
No, he's not. He was an early investor.
Right. You just on and on and on. Having a board like that, does that add more stress to your work, or does it insulate you from outside pressures?
You know what? It does a lot of good things, actually. You know, I'm still in my late 40s, so I'm still learning a lot, right? And so having people like that to learn from and bounce ideas is priceless. That's a privilege that I don't take lightly. I feel extremely blessed to have it. It's incredibly enriching on a personal level. It's incredibly productive for making the project efficient. Yes, they challenge you, but for the good reasons.
Yeah.
They also return a ton in terms of opening doors. The Rolodex of these folks is just second to none. And this is what's gotten us elevated in terms of being able to meet people, whether it's for financial purposes or other reasons that otherwise mere mortals wouldn't, right? And the fact that they are engaged, many of them as investors, is an endorsement value that's also enormous. I'd say there's nothing negative whatsoever, other than when you first meet them, you're intimidated. You're thinking, who am I? Come this demigod. But the fact is, they're in the end human beings that connect here on a level of vision, and then they just get excited, and then you get absolutely their best time and effort and focus when needed. And much of that really comes because of this great purpose and promise. Once they get convinced that this is really doable, it's a formidable engine, and we're very, very blessed to have it.
And make sure and thank them all for us for taking the risk to try to make something like this a reality. There's been a lot about the first moon landings and everything, and this is definitely on that level, if not
well,
more.
I will tell you, I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I thank you for having said this just this moment ago, because I tell our employees all the time, don't take any moment of this for granted. Enjoy the incredible ride we have. Enjoy the moment. We obviously be passionate, but just just feel blessed that we have this incredible privilege. I tell you, I wake up every morning and I feel I'm the most privileged guy on the planet. I get to do what I love. I can hopefully make an enormous difference. In the course of it, I meet some of the most incredible people walking the planet currently, and all for this grander good. It's just a wonderfully fulfilling way of spending life. I couldn't think of anything else I'd rather do.
And there's nothing I'd rather do than talk to you about this, and it's been so great. Michael, I want to finish. This is the lightning round of your thoughts on different energy technologies. So everything below fusion, starting with natural gas.
Clearly, where the industry has gravitated to, it's of course a question of gas price. At the moment, I don't see much change here. When you look at other carbon-based sources, it's cleaner to some degree and can be made even cleaner. Even when fusion deploys during some scale-up, natural gas will be with us.
Crude oil.
At this moment, the quantitative data says it all. 88 million cars sold a year, 0.8% are electric. So we have a long way to go there. But that said, there is going to be a dramatic evolution over the next 10, 20 years in the transportation sector, electrifying. And in fact, we didn't talk about this, but one of TAE's technologies that we developed here is going to hopefully play a good part in that. And then, of course, on the fusion side, we can hopefully meet some of the demand one day. But that's where crude oil sits today. And I always say this to my family, there's other great uses for crude oil, plastics, and here we are burning it up. It's a finite resource. It's wild.
Next one is nuclear, a conventional nuclear, Michael.
The conventional, the big scale, the one we have today. This is something that's shaped perhaps by my affiliation with some of the greats in the industry. In the US, that's sort of dead at the moment. And overseas, clearly in China, if they are deploying, they have to. So I would say big nuclear globally isn't dead, of course, but its heyday is probably past. And when a technology like ours succeeds, then you can clearly see that transition. But as a very strong proponent of clean energy, I have to admit, and I agree fully, its strength is in carbon-free.
Coal.
Well, that's one of those that somewhere can't live without in the world, but rather would. China even is starting to convert, right? Of course, it's on a decline, but it's going to be there for a while. You can probably model that in different ways, different times, but it's coming.
Wind.
We have some technologies that help Q&A and the big blades, the offshore blades. Wind clearly has promise in some parts of the country. Texas, in the North Sea, offshore Germany, they have a lot of wind. Its problems, of course, are with all the renewables, right? It's the capacity factor and the seasonal and diurnal cycling. It will have a place, a fairly perpetual place.
Solar.
Same as wind, I think. As the price coming down, they're getting more efficient, they're getting more cost effective. I think just like wind, California is a good example. There's clearly issues with renewables, but I do believe wind and solar will have a place to stay as we go forward.
Biofuels.
I haven't spent a lot of time thinking of biofuels. It's not a big sector today. Bill Gates said it once very well. It's sort of a form of solar storage. It depends on how fast other things come up. If we have it our way and we're successful, I think it would give a fairly hard life to those, certainly in energy generation, perhaps in the transportation, but in the end, they're not totally carbon free either.
Hydroelectric.
That's a great source, of course. Everybody perhaps likes it. I had an uncle who worked on one of the large hydroelectric plants in Austria in the mountains and been a very good source of income for parts of my family. In the developed world, it's sort of exhausted, but it's a carbon-free source, and I'm sure those plants will have a life.
Geothermal.
Sort of same thing. It's more limited. It doesn't have the broader capability that hydro does. These are more niche. This one's certainly more niche than hydro.
Energy storage.
Good point. Energy storage, well, that goes hand in hand with renewables, right? But I think the fallacy there is people think that's going to solve the problem. The problem is capacity factor, which is an economic number. When you don't generate electrons, you don't generate electrons. Now, you can offset that if the solar farm doesn't produce because there's no sun coming down. You can suck it out of the battery, but you're clearing out the reservoir. At some point, you're going to run dry. It's a buffer. It's an important one. I think its future is more in evening out the grid, which you probably know a lot more than I do. The economics of the capacity factor there are going to play an impact.
You touched on this one earlier, electric vehicles.
Now, these are a big deal. First of all, we've got to get rid of the single polluter on the street. No doubt about it. I think they can be better performance, too, once people realize that. Even the most ardent supporters of big combustion engines will probably like this. And I have to admit, I like cars. That is good for the electricity sector because that's going to generate more demand. We can take it from the individual polluter back to a central facility where we hopefully can have either carbon sequestration or other filtering things. Electric vehicles are a must, and they're coming, and I think they have all the right incentives to really take over the next 20 years or so.
Energy efficiency.
So me, I try to live a low carbon, call it today, footprint life, and it's hard. I think, and there's a big room for efficiency improvements. That's economics. I'm sure that's going to happen. That's just a market dynamic, and it makes total sense.
And then finally, I'm sure you know this one, nuclear fusion.
Yeah, well, I think there was a BBC documentary back in the late 2000s done by, you may have seen it. It's very good. If you haven't, it's done by a guy named Brian Cox. I think it was called How to Make a star on Earth or something.
Yeah.
And at the end, they summarize and say fusion is sort of the get out of jail card free for humanity. I like that. I think that in ways true. It's carbon free. If it's done right, it will have infinite fuel supply on a human perspective. If it's done with PB11, it'll be free of radioactive output of any substance. It can be deployed in high population density centers. It can load follow. It can produce reliable base load. I mean, not in next year, but once we have had enough experience with it to tweak out all the little gremlins, it is the future. I have no doubt, and I hope Tralfa will be the one. I'm pretty sure we have a very, very good shot today, but that's the future for humanity. No doubt about it.
Michael Binderbauer, getting the world out of jail.
Yeah, part of the mission.
All right, Michael Binderbauer, TAE Technologies, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it, Jay.
That was Michael Binderbauer, CEO of TAE Systems, formerly Tri-Alpha Energy, a for-profit nuclear fusion company. Michael was just a student in the 90s when he and Professor Norman Rostocker began working on what is now the company's flagship design. Dr. Rostocker passed away in 2015, and the company's latest generator is called the Norman in honor of him. That unit was unveiled in 2017 and has gone on to perform more than 3,000 experiments. I want to thank Michael for his time and David Ewing on TAE's communications team for making this happen. I also want to thank Steve Dean, my guest from episode 20 and a nuclear fusion pioneer who helped make the introductions for me. All guests are sent the raw and completed audio the week of release. So far, no complaints. Be sure to leave a positive review on iTunes. That gets the word out. You can check out plenty of pictures online at energy-cast.com and on Instagram at Host Energy. Music was produced by Sean Stroop at Stroop Loops. That wraps up episode 45. Be sure to join us next week when we explore the abundant potential of hydroelectric energy in our city's water utilities. Until then, I'm Jay Dowenhauer. We'll see you next time.